of the people voting. I think that the Citizens Assembly has been empowered with a bare majority of the Assembly to, so that's, what is it, 81 people, right? They will be able to recommend what the referendum question is. That will go to the people of British Columbia, and if they vote for it, it's going to be implemented.
It's actually sort of a double system, right? You've got to get 60%?
Well, you have to get 60% of the votes, and you have to get a majority of the votes in 60% of the ridings. But as we saw last time, if you get 60% of the vote province-wide, you're going to win a vast majority of the ridings. I mean, we won every riding but 2 on a majority basis last time. The BC Liberals,
short on the
BC Liberals, when they get 57% of the vote province-wide, you know, win every province. It's the 60% overall that's the hurdle, not the riding by riding count.
I haven't seen any opinion polling on this. Independent? I know the pollsters haven't asked questions on this yet, have they?
Bruce could answer that. He had a poll released, I think. We haven't released ours yet, but we will.
Oh, okay. But I was meaning the organizations that normally poll people for their voting intentions province-wide, which we do see. I haven't seen them asking these questions yet, independently.
I haven't. We've done a poll. I understand you have, and be surprised if we weren't. But I haven't seen any independent polls published at this stage. Ours found that 65% of respondents favored STV. Obviously, I think that was based on about a 30% recognition of the question. There's a lot of room to go in getting people up to speed. That poll's about a month old now, but it found broad support for reform.
One more question along the lines of where did this come from, and I'd like to get this out just because the Citizens Assembly on Electoral Reform, which was ordinary British Columbians, great group of people. I went and watched some of their meetings. They were fun to watch. It was a fascinating institution. And they looked at all the options, concluded we needed a new system for electing our politicians, and they picked STV. Here with a comment on that, Troy Lanigan.
This is a different system than was voted on both in Ontario and Prince Edward Island. And what's important is that this system was grounded in the recommendation of average citizens. It wasn't imposed by politicians. It was something that was brought up from the grassroots, discussed by people with no agenda. This is the recommendation that came up. It has legitimacy because of that. So it obviously has a lot more resonance with the public when they understand it was a citizens' assembly that put this forward, not politicians cobbled behind closed doors, or many decisions are presented to the public as.
And when it almost passed, but not quite, and the Premier decided to have another referendum, he also decided to stick with the Assembly's recommendation. That's why it's STV. You know, these other systems aren't on the list. Do you think it has extra legitimacy because this Citizens Assembly produced it?
Well, I disagree with what Troy said for one reason. The Premier said, and the government said to the Citizens Assembly, you can recommend anything you like, but you can't increase the size of the legislature, the number of members of the legislature. And that effectively prohibited MMP, which was in fact mixed member proportional, which was in fact what the Green Party wanted, what the majority of people who wanted a change wanted MMP, which is what they had on the ballot in Ontario. So because the government's rules were such, the short version is they could not have created a pool. They would have had single member ridings and then the pool of MLAs to make up the difference in the popular vote. And they would have had to increase the size of the legislature considerably or otherwise have gigantic ridings, single member ridings. So the STV decision was basically somewhat forced, I believe, by the government's decision that you couldn't increase the size of the legislature because it made MMP almost an impossible option for the Assembly.
See, I fundamentally disagree, and I've talked to lots of Assembly members about this. You know, what MMP and STV have in common is that they solve to a large degree the problem with unfair results and disproportionality. They're both much more proportional than first past the post. But STV has this extra issue of accountability. That was really important to the Assembly. If you remember, the year the Assembly met was when Chuck Cadman was running for a nomination and somebody else came in and won, and then he came in as an independent. There was a huge issue about party nomination meetings during that time in the media, and that influenced the Assembly. The Assembly thought, well, we have a system that's so centralized. Whatever the leader says goes, and MLAs are almost like trained seals. And they wanted to fix that. You're not going to fix that by having a party list sort of system, but you do fix that when you have ridings where people from the same party actually have to run against each other and have to distinguish themselves as representatives of the riding. That was what really influenced the Citizens' Assembly, I think.
But Bruce, I mean, one of the things that we see in Ireland when we look at it is the opposite. In fact, the parties are more powerful in Ireland. It's harder to dislodge or a TD, as they're called, their members. It's harder for them to get into it. And I just find it sort of the opposite effect, that there's more power through an STV system because, for example, in Victoria, Vaughan, if you're going to run as a third party or an independent or whatever, you're going to have to get out material to 350,000 voters, not 50,000 in the average size riding, but 350,000. And you don't know where the voters are going to be. You could say, well, I just need to concentrate in one area, but you don't know where your voters are. So I say the opposite of what Bruce is saying.
Some of the things that they've disagreed about we're going to come back to as issues. There have been several references to proportionality. And again, the thing that we come back to again and again and people talk about is whether the percentages of the vote, if you get 40% of the vote in the province-wide, do you get 40% of the seats? If the system is proportional, that's roughly what happens. If you get 20% of the vote, you might get 20% of the seats. But that doesn't happen in our system. So here, we got different people to say what is STV. Here is Professor Emeritus Norman Ruff answering that question. Here he is.
It's a preferential system, so it means that you get to express your preference among the candidates of all the parties. So you can vote for all the candidates of one party maybe, but you get to say which one you actually prefer. So this means you have a sense that your vote isn't being wasted. It's a candidate-centered system rather than a party-centered system.
So Bill Tillman's talked about this big riding around Victoria, but you'll be electing 7 members, so you might mark your ballot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, couldn't you?
Sure, or up to 40, because you're going to probably have 40 people running, or 45. Yeah. But you're only getting you only have one vote, though, Vaughan. You only have one ballot, and it's fractionalized. So when you start ranking them, each ranking is less and less a fraction of your vote, and you don't really know at the end of the election which fractions went where. That's the problem.
You get the counting system. But a person can go in, and if they like, they can vote for 3 Liberals and a couple of New Democrats and a Green if they want it.
They sure can. I know somebody in Vancouver who's lived there all his life, votes the NPA slate every time. But he always voted for Harry Rankin as well. Lots of people in Vancouver did that. Harry didn't really fit in with the NPA, or with Cope for that matter, but a lot of people thought, there's an independent guy who asks tough questions and we like to have him on council. People like that have a better chance in a system where you're voting for multiple candidates, and that's the kind of thing STV provides. In Ireland, independents get elected. When's the last time an independent got elected in BC?
I want to thank both of the people on the show for really trying to help us explain this thing and not just fire away at each other, as I'm sure